The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Welcome back to Titans of Nuclear. Today I'm here with Vince Zabielski, partner at Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, Pittman. Vince, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, Liam.
Yeah. So let's get started by learning more about you. How did you grow up? Where did you grow up? And how did you get to where you are today?
That's a funny story, actually. I studied mechanical engineering at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And I was quite the hippie at the time. I had long hair, probably down in the middle of my back. And I was getting interviews and I wasn't getting any jobs. And my advisor said, cut that effing hair. And so I did. I spent $5 on a haircut. My next interview was at a nuclear power plant. And that's where it all started, with a haircut. So I was at the Salem and Hope Creek reactors in New Jersey in the US. And so I started out at a boiling water reactor, which is made by General Electric. And then I wound up being system engineering manager at Salem before I started going to school at night for law. And in 2005, after 15 years at the power plant, I graduated from law school and started at one of the big law firms in Washington, D.C. Worked there a few years, then became associate general counsel for a nuclear utility. Did that for a few years. And then the folks from Abu Dhabi called and they said, hey, would you like to come over and be our nuclear counsel? And I was like, where's Abu Dhabi? I did. My wife and I went over to check it out. We just wanted to, see what it was like, and kind of fell in love with the place, and wound up staying there about 4.5 years during the construction of the Baraka nuclear power plants. So I was primarily responsible for the prime contract and the nuclear regulatory aspects, as well as export controls, which was a huge job, given all the nationalities that were working there and all the sensitive technology. And then Pillsbury, my current law firm, invited me to London to be their nuclear guy in Europe. And I said, yeah, sure. And that was about 9 years ago. So here I am, and doing a lot of nuclear legal work all over the world, not just the UK, but the US, China, Japan, you name it, we're pretty much there.
So to trace it back, what made you want to go from your technical background as a mechanical engineer, systems branch manager? What made you want to go back to school and pursue your JD and get more of a legal background?
I had a friend of mine who became a patent lawyer, and that was my original intention, was to become a patent lawyer. He was telling me how great it was and how it changes the way you think and all this. And turned out patent lawyering is pretty boring, at least for me. But as I started studying the law more, I became really interested in it. It's a completely different way of thinking. If you're an engineer, you start with the facts and you work your way to the conclusion. That's called deductive reasoning. A lawyer starts with the conclusion, my client's innocent, and then works back to the facts. So lawyer engineers tend to be a little bit schizophrenic because there's effectively two people inside your brain, depending on whether you're working on an engineering issue or you're working on a legal issue. But once you harness that, it's kind of cool because the engineering side of things informs the legal side of things.
Gotcha. And did you always know that when you were going back to law school that nuclear law was going to be something that interested you? And when did you start thinking that that was going to be a career for you?
I thought of it, and he said, look, Vince, there's a million lawyers out there. It's like, what makes you different is going to be that you have a nuclear background. So that's really what you should focus on. And in retrospect, he was quite right. It was good advice because, if you take away the nuclear bits, I'm just would just be an ordinary kind of a lawyer. But as it is, having kind of a rudimentary knowledge of nuclear physics, and I know how nuclear plants work, at a pretty good level of detail. I'm able to communicate with the CEOs of different companies who typically have a technical background. So my clients like the fact that I could speak their language.
So just speaking more on your technical background, maybe both as your engineering brain and your lawyer side of your brain, could you speak on your initial thoughts on nuclear energy and how those may have changed over time?
Well, my initial thoughts were, wow, what a beautiful machine this is. When I started at Hope Creek, which was the large boiling water reactor, I'd never seen something so gigantic and complicated. And just learning how everything worked was kind of really a lot of fun for a mechanical engineer. Like for a kid who grew up like working on cars and lawnmower engines and stuff like that, this is the biggest, toy mankind has ever made. And then I went over from the boiling water reactor side to the a Westinghouse pressurized water reactor. And gosh, that thing was, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think that the whole conception of the pressurized water reactor is the supreme achievement of mankind. If you think of anything else that we've done as a species, say, gone to the moon, that's really just an extension of like rockets, which had been around for centuries. While a nuclear power plant exploits the physics of matter itself, you're blasting matter into energy, and the amount of matter that's destroyed by nuclear power plants on the order of like, I think 5 grams a day, like the weight of a US nickel. And that's how much power is like in nuclear, there's this whole E equals MC squared thing. But the elegant way in which a PWR extracts that power it's beautiful from a mechanical standpoint because all the systems kind of tie together. You throttle down on the turbine to lower power. It makes hotter water go into the reactor, into the steam generator. There's less heat being removed by the steam generator, so it heats up. And when it heats up, it makes less power. So kind of the reactor follows the throttle of the turbine, just using pretty much natural physics. It's an amazing design. And when the French were choosing their technology to implement, as soon as they saw it, they were like, "This thing's beautiful," So it's kind of I'm a geek that way, I guess. I love machines, and the nuclear reactors are as big as it gets. I love complexity.
And speaking beyond your personal fascination with the machines, what do you believe the machines actually offer to human beings and the planet as a whole?
Well, it's statistically the safest way to make electricity. There was an excellent article a number of years back called "How Deadly Is Your Kilowatt Hour?" It was published in Forbes magazine, and they went through and listed, how many people died in the full cycle from mining to using the coal for generation, to pollution effects, mining accidents, stuff like that. And nuclear is the safest way to make power at scale, even safer than wind and safe. More recent studies put nuclear, solar, and wind at about the same. But it's amazing because you could get so much power in such a small place safely. Like, so if you wanted to power all of the UK, say, on solar, you'd be just covered in solar panels. And solar doesn't work at night, and it's pretty dark here in the winter, so it doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you wanted to do the same thing with nuclear power, it's completely doable. The other part of it, and France really committed to that, in their program. So they have, I think, 70% now of their installed capacities nuclear, and it served them well. They're not beholden to anybody. If somebody blows up a gas line, they don't really care too much. And they're kind of like the powerhouse of Europe now, exporting a lot of power. But all that power comes without carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere as well. You might get a little bit in the mining process and the transportation. That's just an effect of the whole chain not yet being nuclearized. But it ticks all the boxes: energy security, climate, reliability, sustainability. So it's probably, it is the best way to make power that we know of today. Fusion comes along and it works. Maybe that'll be better. I can't see it being any simpler than fission. But we'll see what happens over the next half century, of fusion development. But right now, fission's the best we got.
And given all the environments and all the different jobs you've had during your storied career, could you speak a little bit on the relative attitudes? I know you already touched on France a little bit, but you've worked in the UAE, you've worked in the United States, and now based out of London. Could you speak about the relative attitudes towards nuclear and how you're describing it as a very safe technology, and how is that perceived by governments and by people around the world currently?
Well, it changes over time. In the pre-Chernobyl period, let me step back. We've had a few major accidents over the years. There was Chernobyl. There was Three Mile Island was the first one, although that was a property loss accident. Nobody got hurt in that one. Chernobyl was a pretty major accident, but that was, I'll say, a downright irresponsible design. It was optimized for the production of plutonium. It had no containment, so it was just an accident waiting to happen. Fukushima is interesting though. That plant was built on the intersection of 5 different continental plates in the land that invented the word tsunami. It was entirely preventable as well. But after each of those incidents, you see knee-jerk responses, like Germany after Fukushima decided to shut their whole fleet down. And it's really, if not anything else, it's economic suicide for Germany. They have the highest per capita carbon emissions in the EU. They have the highest per capita, highest total carbon emissions. And they were entirely dependent on Russian gas for their industry. So, I don't know where their power is going to come from, to be honest. The renewables, the power Germany would be just a staggering undertaking. There's not enough wind sites there, and solar, as we discussed, only works during the day until we come up with some way of storing the energy. But the idea of storing like batteries that could power cities, maybe it'll happen someday, but how much lithium do you need? How many rare earth metals do you need to make that happen? You asked about attitude. So in Germany, they're very anti-nuclear. In the UK, I don't think I've ever met anyone who was anti-nuclear. I'm sure it might be just the crowds, the circles I travel in, but it seems to be, fairly well accepted here. And nobody loves the nuclear more than the communities that host the plants. For example, we had a bunch of, when I was at the power plant in the US, there were a bunch of protesters out front, and we're like, where'd these people come from? Well, they came down from Connecticut, which was, 250 miles away, to protest nuclear. And so what we did was we set up barbecues out front and fed them all, and, just let them do their thing, and then they went home. But nuclear power contributes an enormous amount to the local tax base. And it's not just the taxes, it's also all the, the local food establishments. It brings in highly paid jobs for the locals. So it's kind of, it depends on where you go. If you're in New York City, if you're in Manhattan, and say left leaning, you're going to probably be against nuclear. If you're out in the country near a nuclear plant, you're probably going to support it. But the trends over time, I think right now, the UK especially is tremendously pro-nuclear. I mean, the Conservatives and Labour both agree that nuclear needs no investment, and it's the way to go for energy security in the UK. That's probably the only thing that the Tories and Labour agree on. Everything else they kind of diverge on. So it's something we could all get behind. Unfortunately, and I'm sure we'll get to this at some point, this conversation should have been happening 10, 20 years ago rather than right now. But you know what they say, the best time to plant a tree was, 10 years ago. Second best time's right now. So it's the same with nuclear power.
So I wanted to bring that up. That quote that you just mentioned, that seemed to be the thesis of an article that you wrote last July in the Critic, labeled "The Need for Nuclear." Has your attitude changed since then, or are you still a believer that it's a pro-British thing to be energy independent? The need for nuclear is still as high as it was last year. Have your thoughts changed on that at all?
Well, they've changed. My understanding is the situation's even more dire than I thought it was when I wrote that article. We have 5 operating nuclear power stations here in the UK. One of them, Sizewell B, which is a big pressurized water reactor. The others are 2-unit advanced gas reactors. But each of those sites puts out about 1,200 megawatts. So there's 5 reactors. Between now and 2028, unless something happens, 4 of those will be shut down. They're at end of life. All of those, the AGRs, over time, they have a finite design lifetime. And you could tweak a year or 2 out of them at the end, but you're not gonna run them like 100 years, Sizewell B is a different design. It could easily it goes 40 years without, cracking a sweat. It could be easily extended to 60-year lifetime, and possibly even up to 80 years. And those are the types of reactors, pressurized water reactors, that are being built now at Hinkley Point C. It's a different design. It's a French design, but it's an evolution of the Westinghouse PWR design. And those could last, the design life 60 years on those, and they could, get extensions beyond that. So you build a nuclear power plant, it's gonna give a lifetime, really, of close to a lifetime of power. And it's hard to measure in net present value terms, what a megawatt of electricity is worth to society, 60 years from now. It will be discounted down to like meaningless. But in real life, having a 60-year power supply is a pretty good thing. Back in July July right after the Russians invaded Ukraine, on a high demand day here, it was like a perfect storm. The grid almost collapsed. And to prevent that from happening, we had to buy electricity from Belgium, but now Belgium is 50% nuclear power. 50% of Belgium's power comes from nuclear. So we bought those last, few megawatts of juice that we needed. We paid 10,000 pounds per megawatt hour, which is insane. I mean, before the pandemic, I think the average price was $40. Like, you could look at the trends over time. During the pandemic years, and actually then up to during the invasion, it went up to about 200 pounds a megawatt hour. But I mean, 10,000 pounds a megawatt hour, can't do that for more than, a couple hours at a time, I suppose. So that really highlighted how vulnerable we are. And it's going to get worse. Liam, I was saying there's 4 plants are going to shut down. You take 1,200 megawatts off of the grid 5 times in a row. That's going to be a really big impact. If you consider just this last winter, well, actually this current winter, it doesn't feel like winter anymore. Global warming, thanks to fossil fuel. But if it gets below freezing here in London, there's emergency procedures in place to keep the grid stable. So there'll be load shedding. People can voluntarily sign up for a program that shuts their electricity off, because the grid's already hanging by a thread on the worst days. When it's dark out, there's no solar. If the wind stops blowing, then you're completely on fossil and you're on nuclear. And if you lose 4 out of 5 of your nuclear plants, and it's not an if, it's going to happen, in the short term, something's going to have to replace that. And there's nothing right now to replace it. So, I think we will see rolling blackouts where you'll see sections of the country that don't have power, and we'll be power rationing. And it's just the maths. There was a recent article. It was sponsored by Drax, the company that burns wood pellets to make power. But it was pretty factual. I read it. I agree with it. We're going to have a real power pinch between now and when Hinkley Point C comes online. That's the big French project. Nuclear project. And even then, we're going to have less capacity than we do today with our 5 nuclear plants. So it's going to be a rough ride.
And you had mentioned that the blackout that occurred with the need for supplementation by Belgium as being one of the most expensive transactions of energy in the UK's history. Along with that, and the
I think it was a world record, actually.
The sting felt from that, and you're saying, the capacity for that to happen in the future, that's not going to be a one-time thing, unless we have more reasonable ways of energy security. That on top of the fact that you're saying that a desire for nuclear may be a bipartisan issue, what, in your opinion, are then the barriers for what seems to be a good solution to an inevitable problem?
The problem is that it's multifaceted. First of all, nobody in government saw this coming, and if they did, nobody was saying anything about it. It's the government's job to protect our security, and this is a huge security threat. Not having electricity, it'll be mayhem. Imagine if the grid goes down for like a week. What are people going to be doing? It's gotten pretty wild outside as it is, with the recession and COVID and all. It's not going to be good. The problem, though, is that it takes probably, at least if you do everything right, it's going to take 10 years to get a power plant built and online. One of the big traditional nuclear power plants. If everything goes well. You look at the UAE, they probably have the best record of, delivering a nuclear power plant more or less on time and on budget in the the modern world. Sizewell B here in the UK was a triumph. It was on time. It was on budget. We used to know how to build these things. The problem is we really don't know anymore. The people who used to build nuclear power plants retired for the most part. So we have to relearn those skills. And this is where I think the UK is doing an exceptionally good job, because they're not just thinking of, let's build a power plant, but they're thinking of the whole educational process. There's apprenticeships, programs that are being set up, and they recognize that without the skills, you're not going to be able to run a massive nuclear power program. The other promising thing is small modular reactors, and the promise there is that you won't have these construction delays. But the biggest problem, in my view, of with nuclear power plants, the large ones, is that it's just there's too much construction risk currently. The way the contracts are set up, it doesn't encourage the parties to work together to get the job done. It makes, they're adversarial. I would advocate developing a new contracting strategy for nuclear power plants where everybody's incentivized to the same goal. And then, maybe once we get our skills up, we'll be able to start, cranking the large plants out. The smaller modular reactors, they're going to be, I think it's a great idea. I don't know if you knew it, but, the U.S. Polar expedition in Antarctica, they ran off a SMR for like 10 years back in the 70s. The base was powered by a pressurized water reactor and basically a container.
I did not know that.
So it has been done. But here's the problem. Here's what I see the problem with, that nobody's talking about yet, and we'll talk about it right now. Modular reactors, I think, are a fantastic idea. There's nothing particularly difficult about building them. It's known technology. If we're talking about, the GE or the Rolls-Royce designs, these are standard, water cooled and moderated reactors. That's not the problem. The problem is going to be that you need a training organization. You need qualified nuclear operators. And if your reactor is 100 megawatts or it's 1,500, you still have the same skill sets necessary to run that plant. So I think the focus really needs, the conversation needs to not turn away from how do we build the small modular reactors, but a side conversation has to be how do we operate them? Because like I worked in nuclear power for many years, and the training organizations there, you have a simulator. You have to train these operators, and they're like a special breed. They're like kind of like closest to other profession would be like an airline pilot, where you have to know everything technically about your machine, and you have to have a safety mindset. And these are pretty special people. You just don't go out and find a nuclear operator. They have to one want to do it, and two, they have to be pretty darn smart. So let's say I'm a university and I want a small modular reactor, or I'm a hospital, to power my hospital. Those types of applications, they're not going to go out and create an entire nuclear training program and have their simulator and all for a 100 megawatt plant or a 50 megawatt plant. So somebody's going to have to come up with some kind of a common operating, rent an operator kind of situation where you recruit these people, you train them, pooling operators from, half a dozen, or 100 different SMR sites. And maybe somebody's talking about this. I haven't heard of it yet, but the idea of just, going out and buying an SMR and turning it on, it just doesn't work that way.
Gotcha. And considering all that, and potential obligations and potential hurdles that need to be jumped in the future for SMR development and just development of nuclear energy in the future, how is your mindset on the legal landscape of nuclear right now? Is it running in tandem with the development of the technology and the regulations, or is it falling behind? What are your thoughts as a lawyer in the field?
Uh, it's a difficult balance because the processes for like environmental permitting and community acceptance and all that, those are important processes. And I think if we start to streamline those too much, we're going to undermine public confidence. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. Yeah, we'll get our permits through faster, but at what cost? So I'm very much an environmentalist. I want the environmental impact assessment to be thorough. I don't want to cut corners on that. But this is why I think the sooner you start, the sooner you'll be finished. No journey that I think it was Chairman Mao, not to quote Mao, but the longest journey is the one you haven't started yet. And the thing is, the most important thing is we've got to get started. This energy crisis is coming. Right now, it's just a matter of how long is it going to last. We have to figure out how to end this crisis that's coming. So if we do the permitting correctly, it does take time. I don't actually see LNR as being very heavy-handed in the regulatory approach. They seem to be flexible while still, maintaining high safety standards. They're more focused on objectives rather than, prescriptive, requirements for the sake of requirements. So I wouldn't mess with it too much. It works pretty well here. The West has a pretty good nuclear safety record. Knock on wood. But I don't really favor any corner cutting. If there's administrative stuff that we could cut down on, that's great. I would look at it, say where's the value add. But I'm in favor of a strong regulator.
And you talked about the need for starting on the path and starting the journey. In your opinion, who are the leaders right now, and who do you think the leaders will be in the next 5, 10, 20 years, whether that be governments, parties, companies? Who do you see as helping lead the charge for this?
Well, I see the UK government as really helping to lead the charge. They're tremendously pro-nuclear, mainly because I don't think that there's another choice. It's really hard to cite wind projects here. When we see kind of a walking away from wind development, I think we're kind of reaching a max there. We might see like offshore floating wind. That might be something new. But the cool thing about nuclear power in the UK is there's so many shut down nuclear power stations that are still there with the grid infrastructure leading right up to it. So it would be fairly easy for the UK, and people have figured this out, to go nuclear. Also, the UK is kind of, well, it's light on resources, right? There's not much oil left. The coal mines have been shut. It doesn't have a huge geographical territory, so there's not a whole lot of choices, honestly, for a modern industrial society. So nuclear kind of ticks all the boxes, and it took them a while to get there, but government seems to realize that, and hopefully they'll continue to. I'm a little alarmed by Labor's throttling back on the green plans. I don't know where that leaves nuclear. But the whole conversation is going to change absolutely radically if the lights start going out. It's going to get personal with people. And if we're going to avoid the worst effects of that, we need to start right now. And I mean, things have started, but we need to focus on the mission, like almost like on a wartime footing. Like, how do we get out of this? Because it's going to be bad.
Right. And you had
Not
already
to be so depressing.
you had already mentioned that there the problems have already started to arise, and we were lucky to have a pretty mild winter thanks to global warming and the damage that's already been done. But that's not always guaranteed. That doesn't mean that in the future things are going to be mild. We need to prepare for potential blackouts in the future and potential problems that may arise.
That's absolutely right. I mean, even a squirrel knows to save nuts, for the winter. You know, um, we got really lucky, I think, especially after the Ukraine invasion. If it had been, a brutally cold winter, it would have been people die. Blackouts aren't the problem is you lose heat, too. So it's like uh, the most vulnerable people in society are going to be hit the worst. And the other thing with nuclear is it's kind of predictable. Once the plants are up and running, it's predictable how much they're going to cost. So you're not going to have wild swings in commodity prices like we're seeing with gas and oil. It's up, it's down. Nuclear, um, it's more of a stable market, and the cost of the actual uranium is relatively insignificant compared to the cost of running the plant. Um, so you don't have the same variability with nuclear pricing as you do with other sources of power.
And even given the recession and the slowing down of the economy, do you think that investment and increased spending on nuclear energy and these energies for the future, do you think that will remain consistent, or do you see the next 5 years something changing to the business models of this development?
Well, I think there's kind of halfway, there's a path that treads a line through government assistance and private investment, and that is the RAB model, where the government guarantees that effectively the people who will benefit from the use of the electricity pay for the plant while it's being built. Now, this could be a recipe for disaster if there's not the right checks and balances. But if it's implemented well, and we have good contracts, and we have good project management, we'll save a lot of money building these new plants by using the RAB model, because instead of having financing during construction, you just pass those costs on to the customer base, and that, I think, is going to be the way that things are going to be financed going forward in nuclear. The CFD didn't really work. Contract for difference used for Hinkley Point C, you still wind up with a lot of risk for the developer. You wind up, I think it's like a third or a half. Don't quote me on that, but it's published somewhere. Of the cost of that nuclear power plant is just due to financing during construction. Because it doesn't make any money until that final breaker closure. You're putting electricity on the grid. Until you get to that point, it's just bleeding you dry, and it's 10 years. There's not a lot of money that's that patient either. Like, you're not going to get a venture capitalist who's going to see, have his money tied up for 10 years, so the model needs to change. And fortunately it has, the RAB will work here. I think it's a great idea. And, let's get going.
Let's get going. And given all this change and future expectations and what's going to take place over the next decade moving forward for all the development of these reactors, and given your always changing career, changing jurisdictions, changing professions, where do you see yourself in the next 5, 10 years, and how do you see your career changing?
Oh, that's a great question. My wife was asking me the same thing. I think this is the longest job. Well, second longest job I've ever had has been working as a nuclear engineer at Pillsbury. Um, it's it's an exciting time, and Britain's an exciting place to be because it's so pro-nuclear. And it's also close to other markets. Like Poland is a really interesting market. Bulgaria is building new power plants, Romania. So I don't really plan any major career changes, unless it's like rock star or something like that. But I think I'll probably be doing this for another couple decades. We've got partners at our law firm who are still practicing into their 80s, and they do it because they like it. It's kind of fun sometimes.
It sounds like you're very excited by the prospect of the future. You remain optimistic about the development and how exciting it is for you to do the work day to day. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Now it doesn't mean that I might not move back to the U.S. during the winter over the next few years. I hope it's not as bad as I fear it is. But I I think we're going to go through some tough times here, to be honest with you. But I'm excited to be part of the solution to the extent that I can help. I think one of the things that is critically overlooked is the quality of the contract for delivery of the power plant, and the allocation of risks. I mean, for decades, everybody thought that the best idea was to push all the risk onto the contractor. And we saw that with Westinghouse at the plants they were building in the US. They went bankrupt. Same thing with Areva. Areva was building a Finnish plant, the plant in Finland that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. It starts with an O. But those contracts pretty much bankrupted the suppliers because they put risks on the suppliers at the risk that the supplier couldn't control. So when I do a nuclear power contract, for a big project, and Pillsbury did the contracts for the successful Baraka units, you want to think of how do I avoid disputes between the parties, and if disputes do arise, how do we resolve them amicably, and how do we look ahead for problems that are inevitably going to happen and work together to solve them instead of fighting over it. And that's the structure where everybody's fighting for the same thing, on the same side, and that's completing the plant on time and on budget. If the contract rewards all parties for the desired outcome, you're going to get the desired outcome. And that's the problem. A lot of I think utilities will be like, oh no, we're the utility. We're going to tell the contractor what we want. We're going to tell them how to do it, and we're going to put all the risk on them. Risk is just the contractor just charges extra the more risk you put on them. So if you want to have the optimum point, the lowest price point, it's where the contractor has the lowest risk for risks that are outside of his control. But that's I could talk an hour on that topic. And it's not just nuclear power plants, everything. Our whole concept of contract is wrong. We put liquidated damages. Okay, if you're late by a week, the contractor will pay, 100,000, pounds or something. It's like, okay, so say your airport's, a year late, and your liquidated damages have ran out. You've got an extra $500,000 off the price, but you still don't have an airport. It's like it's just kind of an old-fashioned way of looking at contracts that's still prevalent. But I think there's a much better way to do it. Happy to talk to anyone out there who's interested in the topic as well.
Gotcha. And with time winding down for our conversation, is there any last message you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, two things. One, the nuclear waste problem, because every conversation I get into someone who would be otherwise pro-nuclear, It always comes back to waste. And the thing with spent nuclear fuel, or used nuclear fuel, as some like to say, is that it can be recycled. It's just an economic problem right now. We could store it safely for centuries. But the fact is, at some point, we're going to be using that same fuel over and over again when we get into a closed fuel cycle. So we're just kind of holding on to it for now. It's not waste. It's worthwhile. It has value. The other thing is that when a nuclear plant makes waste, it's contained. When a fossil plant makes waste, it goes up the chimney. All the mercury coming out of a coal plant, winds up and bioconcentrates in the tuna, and you have that for your for lunch, at your Hawaiian poke place. So there's no plutonium in your tuna, but there's plenty of mercury from all the years of burning fossil fuels. The second thing, final point, is safety. I spent 15 years inside a nuclear power plant, and I never felt safer anywhere else in the world. You leave work, and that's when you get paranoid. You're crossing the road, like, are there any buses coming or whatever? I can honestly say, hand on heart, that I never felt safer than at the power plant, because you're surrounded by people who are completely dedicated to safety. Like, say you walk out in the plant, you forgot your safety glasses, your personal protective equipment. You would not be able to move 3 feet until somebody would stop you, confront you, and say, "Where's your safety glasses?" It's an innate culture of safety, and everybody's constantly talking about safety. And if you bring up a safety concern, you could bring it up to anybody in any way, and you're completely protected. It's one of the only places in the world where, like, you're absolutely safe, from retaliation, and physically safe, So so that's my 2 final points. Nuclear waste is good. Nuclear power is safe.
Well, Vince, on behalf of Titans of Nuclear, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.